Winter 1991 began with a change in the air across the Arabian Peninsula. Airfields pulsed with steady routines, tents glowed with low light, and radios carried clipped voices that rarely betrayed emotion. Along the Persian Gulf, long lines of vehicles sat under tarps as crews checked maps, fuel, and rations with practiced calm. In distant capitals, studio anchors spoke in careful tones about an international coalition, a clear mandate, and a limited aim. The phrase that traveled fastest was precision, a promise that power could be shaped and directed with restraint. Yet on the ground, the atmosphere felt less certain. Sand moved in slow curtains that hid edges and landmarks, and the horizon seemed farther every hour. This program presents a dramatized account built from public records, news bulletins, archived statements, and field reporting available at the time. It is a work of historical storytelling, not an official record. Events, sequences, and emphasis are arranged to convey the mood and logic of the period as it might have been felt by those watching and waiting. Where viewpoints diverge, we note plausible alternatives without asserting definitive judgment. The aim is clarity and context, not verdicts. The landscape is real. The human caution is real. The language of certainty is quoted as it appeared in briefings and broadcasts. The scale of effort was large, but the experience of it came down to hours that moved slowly and decisions that landed without fanfare. As the first hours approached, planners checked clocks, pilots reviewed routes, and analysts traced arcs on paper maps that looked simple in a quiet room. The night would soon carry those lines into motion, and with it, the world's idea of how a modern war might be seen and understood. The first waves arrived under darkness, when city lights were muted, and rooftop watchers listened for a change in the pitch of the air. From Kuwait to Iraq, people felt it as a pressure before they found words for it. Windows rattled. Dogs went quiet. A few car alarms chirped and then died back into silence. Broadcasters on international networks filled the gap with maps, arrows, and tight language about accuracy, corridors, and selected nodes. The public story emphasized a disciplined start, the trimming of capability with minimal spillover, and an expectation that important sites would soon be quiet. That message was repeated in official press briefings that were released on a steady rhythm and read with a steady voice. The alternative reading, supported by scattered field notes and early wire dispatches, suggested a more shifting ground truth. In neighborhoods near government quarters, families pressed into interior rooms and stairwells, while in outlying districts, some tried to sleep through it and failed. Lights flickered in corridors, elevators stuck between floors, staircases filled with the sound of feet and whispered instructions. In certain quarters, traffic jammed at intersections as drivers took a chance on moving to relatives or shelters, then stalled and turned back when they saw the confusion ahead. On the coalition side, pilots and crews returned with brief remarks about weather, glare, and haze, and then went on to the next scheduled turn. The tone in those rooms was brisk, procedural, and focused, with little appetite for narrative. In the distance, oil facilities, administrative hubs, and communications relays were said to be under pressure. The television signal cut between dark cityscapes and studio graphics that made the night feel legible even when local images were scarce. The power of presentation shaped expectation. Viewers came away with the impression that bursts of light drew clear borders between target and surroundings, that discrete pulses of force made discrete outcomes. Yet even a clean arc in the sky made noise that carried for neighborhoods, and every concussion found its own path through concrete, glass, and plaster. Archived broadcast footage and official press briefings served as the main public frame, and they did steady work. They calmed, they set scope, they suggested a timeline. Field reports hinted at something less tidy. Hospitals moved patients to lower floors and waited to see what the next hour brought. Emergency crews assessed damage to intersections and bridges, not to dramatize the night, but to map movement for the day that would follow. In some districts, water storage tanks were checked, generators were coaxed into life, and office clerks returned to basements to retrieve boxes of files in case buildings could not be reached later. In the Gulf, distant ships kept position while crews took notes on weather bands that wandered up the coast. Inland, air bases cycled quickly, with ground teams clearing dust from instruments, checking tires, and reviewing handwritten lists that had been copied and recopied in the buildup. Back in living rooms far from the region, viewers watched green-tinted images intercut with measured commentary and came to believe that this was a controlled event that would end close to the way it began. The people under the night had no such distance. They worried about elderly parents in buildings without stair rails, about children who covered their ears and sat under tables, about neighbors who were out of town and had left windows unlocked. A few chose to step outside and look toward the horizon. They saw light where the city should be dark and listened for the second and third wave, waiting to learn if the tempo would increase or find a plateau. The promise of precision made sense on charts and in briefing rooms. On the sidewalks, the experience felt like uncertainty taking a shape you could not yet name. And while the first hours were measured as a success in studio terms, the people who managed water, phones, and food supplies treated the night as a sign that the following day would be defined by detours and workarounds. The air phase had started. The ground knew it would carry the weight of whatever came next, as staff officers laid down fresh acetate sheets over their maps and drew the staging marks that would point south and west toward the open sand. When dawn returned, the desert looked unchanged to a casual eye, but those who lived with it sensed a shift. Tracks that were not there the day before now crossed low ridges. New berms appeared near staging zones. Pallets stood in neat stacks under netting, and the angle of vehicles hinted at a plan that would soon move. Camps woke to routines that felt grounded by habit. Water heated in metal cans, checklists read aloud, boots cleaned of grit, and lenses wiped with care. Supply officers walked the lines with clipboards, counting what had been used and what must not run short. The air had cooled enough to make movement efficient and to hold sound a little longer than usual. It carried the rumble of engines through the morning, even when the engines were not visible. In briefings, leaders described a simple approach: hold, shape, probe, and when the timing aligned, move with speed. The language was plain because complexity could not fit into a daily update. On paper, the concept belonged to the wide desert, the clean arrow, the short line from origin to objective. On the ground, a less tidy rhythm ruled. Weather reports drew narrow bands across maps and suggested gusts that could shift during the afternoon. If the wind rose, visibility would drop and signals would carry differently. Field weather reports and operations room agenda notes served as quiet indicators of these constraints. In that light, the day's work took on a practical cast. Drivers rehearsed turns around berms that looked identical. Navigators checked bearings against distant towers and received reminders to distrust anything that seemed too perfect in a mirage. Medics rewound bandages in tidy coils and confirmed locations for quick transfers if needed. Quartermasters swapped out tools that had picked up rust at the coast. The sense of a clock ticking grew without being mentioned. Outside the camps, the opposing side worked within its own patterns. Some moved equipment along prepared routes that paralleled old drainage lines. Others added stakes and wire to positions they preferred to hold. Still others stood by and waited for orders that took longer to arrive than expected. Observers in the region reported a mixture of discipline and strain, a logic built on depth and traps, but burdened by gaps in command. Civilians in border towns adjusted to convoys on main roads and gave them a little more room than before. Merchants opened late and closed early. Rumors traveled faster than trucks. For the coalition, the desert served as both cover and test. It allowed a concentration of force away from fixed expectations, yet it forced a consistent pace if cohesion was to hold. A single wrong turn could put a column out of position by a distance that mattered. Dust created by one unit could blind another for long minutes. Crews measured water by habit, not drama, and kept close watch on simple parts that failed more often than complex ones. The official line remained calm. The posture was sound, the timing deliberate, and the horizon under watch. The alternative view, expressed in cautious memos and quiet side conversations, emphasized the risks of any forward mass in an environment that erased detail and punished delay. If the order to advance came in the evening, routes would be harder to read. If it came at noon, heat shimmer would toy with distance. A staff officer stood over a table and moved a paper strip that marked a main axis of advance by a few centimeters to avoid a low escarpment that an aerial image had failed to show. Drivers received that small change as an address to memorize, not a theory to debate. In that work, the campaign felt less like a demonstration than a chain of ordinary tasks performed correctly, many times in a row. At midday, the wind picked up and then fell, as if the desert wanted to remind everyone who set the tempo. Radios carried short bursts of guidance and then went quiet. A liaison officer arrived at a tent and marked 2 names from a duty roster. Their vehicles needed inspection for a faint vibration at speed. The change meant a shift in formation and a slight drag on a schedule that was already tight. That adjustment made sense to those in the line. It would never appear in a press briefing. When the sun lowered, the camp moved from preparation to a careful stillness. Lights were shielded, engines idled and stopped. A final list of points appeared on a board, and the hours between late evening and first light were set aside for rest that few found easy. For some, the thought of the next day sat at the edge of sleep. For others, sleep did not come. On the other side of the line, scouts watched dust geysers rise and fall along the horizon and tried to assign meaning to movements that carried just out of range. Everyone knew the night would decide whether the next morning opened on a continued wait or on the sound of a broad push. In this balance, the desert showed its nature as both empty and crowded, silent and full of signals. The staging was done, the routes penciled, the bridges noted, the fallback points named in quiet voices, and written once more in neat block letters. With that, the camps took a breath and waited for the word that would turn lines on a map into movement across sand. The word arrived without emphasis, carried by a familiar voice and a time code, as if it were one more entry on a schedule. Engines came alive in a ripple rather than a roar. Men and women tightened straps, checked mirrors, and confirmed spacing, then eased forward until the line found its pace. The desert accepted the weight in a low groan and released it as a long trail of dust that hung behind the columns like a ledger of where they had been. The plan assumed speed where the surface allowed and patience where micro-terrain argued back. Scouts rid the ground and sent back short reports with quiet confidence, and the main body moved in patterns that would look like geometry from above, but felt like a series of small, necessary choices at ground level. The official language that accompanied these hours was steady. Advances were measured, opposition was scattered, and the line to the objective remained intact. Daily situation reports provided the public face of that rhythm. The alternative account, assembled from field notes and humanitarian agency bulletins, suggested that even an efficient advance carried friction that mattered to those inside it and to civilians who found themselves in its path. In early stretches, the terrain allowed a clean run across firm sand. Then, without warning, patches of softer ground reached up and held tracks just long enough to compress a formation that needed room to breathe. Drivers adjusted with short corrections. Guides moved to flanks to flag a better line. The column lengthened and then recovered. Communications stayed crisp because the cost of confusion in such moments was more delay, and delay in daylight drew attention. At a choke point near a shallow wadi, vehicles bunched as a lead element slowed to verify an approach that looked familiar but carried a subtle shift in slope. A pause that lasted minutes felt like an hour to those in the rear. Crews who knew the drill stepped out, looked once, and signaled forward. The advance resumed with slightly wider intervals, a small adjustment that let the formation breathe again. These were not dramatic events, but they decided whether the plan held its shape past the first horizon. Along the way, signs of the opposing side appeared and then dissolved. A trench line poorly cut. A berm collapsed on one corner. A burned-out vehicle with its tires missing. At a crossroads of compacted sand, faint tracks suggested a movement that had passed in the night. The formation noted it and continued. When contact did come, it came as a series of sharp exchanges that revealed more by their brevity than by their size. Dust and smoke reduced visibility. The air vibrated in short pulses. And then, as quickly as it began, the immediate pressure eased. Reports logged these moments as localized, a word that signaled the plan still held. For those inside the events, the word felt thin. They counted their people, checked for heat issues, and returned to the pace that had been set at the start. Civilians along this stretch of desert lived their day inside movements they neither chose nor could avoid. Some had already left homes near main routes during the nights of air pressure. Others stayed and watched ships of sand pass by with their doors barred and their children kept close. A few stood by wells and listened for news carried by drivers. A grocer in a small roadside cluster opened late and sold flour and dates to anyone who paid in cash, then closed again when the dust grew thick. Humanitarian teams farther south prepared to receive families who drifted in small groups, dazed more by uncertainty than by injury, and asked basic questions. Where can we stop? Where is safer? Should we wait or move? Bulletins recorded these conditions in spare language. Back at the coalition line, the day moved in layers. The advance on the main axis pushed forward. Supporting elements kept pace to provide room and order. Engineers cleared small obstacles that never rose to the level of the evening brief. The engine's note changed with the angle of the wind. The sun made visibility better until it made it worse. Drivers drank water by schedule, not thirst. A liaison checked a route that crossed an old pipeline and decided to swing a kilometer left to avoid ground that tested suspension. The map on the dash reflected that change with a pencil mark. The change made a difference that no broadcast would explain. In another sector, a small detachment took a wrong turn at a feature that looked like every other feature within 10 kilometers. They realized the error early, corrected their bearing, and rejoined the main body with only a minor loss of time. Such errors were not embarrassments. They were natural outcomes in a terrain that forgave little. What mattered was detection and return to pace. Later, as the afternoon edged toward evening, a bank of haze formed low and opaque over the flats. The column slowed a fraction to keep spacing honest. In that slower motion, the logic of the day felt clear. Speed had value, but cohesion had more. The line could move for hours, but it could not afford to stretch into isolated pieces that invited confusion. Field leaders reminded teams that the objective was not a point on a map, but a state of balance between movement and awareness. Reports to higher command stayed crisp. They listed positions relative to reference points agreed upon the night before, noted minor delays, and observed that the plan held. The opposing side, in places, appeared to be shifting away rather than holding. In others, it prepared small ambushes that might cost time, but not direction. The coalition read these signs as confirmation that momentum favored a broad sweep. The view from outside, for those who watched grainy footage and listened to anchor voices that never rushed, was that a new way of war had made the old problems small. Inside the dust, the problems were not small. They were constant and concrete. A clogged filter, a radio with a loose connector, a driver who needed a minute more than the schedule allowed. Good units absorbed such incidents and kept their shape. Toward nightfall, light went flat, shadows disappeared, and distances began to lie. A commander ordered a short halt to reset spacing before the last push to a designated line. Engines idled. Crew stretched arms and backs. Packets of dry food opened. Someone wrote a note home they would send when they could. The pause lasted long enough for dust to fall and thoughts to settle, but not long enough to invite drift. When the order came to move, the columns rolled again. The day had added miles to the map and removed a measure of doubt that could only be changed by action. The evening would decide whether the habit of momentum could be carried into night without paying a price in confusion. The choice of when to stop, where to hold, and how to hand the next hours to the next shift would be made with the same quiet care that started the day. As the line prepared to align on a new point and keep the pace that the wider plan required. Night returned, and with it a second theater that ran alongside the sand and the roads. Screens in living rooms and bars displayed careful maps, studio lighting, and the confident cadence of anchors who had learned the day's rhythm by heart. Graphics turned wide distances into narrow lines and tidy arcs. A calm phrase appeared again and again: measured progress, limited impact, controlled outcomes. Official press briefings supported that view with schedules, talking points, and a consistent tone. The public story felt coherent because it linked cause to effect with a straight cord. In the field, coherence did not always travel as quickly. Field reports from correspondents and relief teams recorded evacuations that seemed improvised, queues at fuel depots that paused without warning, and sudden changes in road access that turned short trips into long detours. The contrast did not mean deception. It meant two clocks were running at once. One clock served presentation, the other served movement. In the presentation clock, the air phase had set a frame that comforted distant audiences. In the movement clock, people adjusted to daily irregularities that prevented a neat script. A bridge rumbling at noon might carry nothing at dusk. A district that seemed quiet in the morning could see traffic redirected by evening as planners shifted weight to a different axis. In that gap, memory formed along two grooves. One groove preserved the tidy alignment of nightly summaries. The other held the slow memory of delays, reroutes, and the practical strain of doing basic tasks under pressure. Archival press briefings and wire bulletins offered a clear record for the first groove, while relief situation updates with their spare sentence fragments documented the second. A family in a dense quarter near a government center timed its cooking to short windows when power held, and then ate by candlelight with the windows open to avoid smoke. Hospital staff planned for repeat events rather than one final surge, arranging beds on lower floors and moving outpatients to scheduled daytime slots when travel felt safer. In depots behind the coalition line, supply teams used colored tape and hand-marked signs to simplify the flow for drivers who had already made several runs. The trick was not in a grand strategy. It was in reducing small frictions. The same applied to public messaging. Spokespeople learned which phrases reassured without promising too much. They spoke about progress and restraint and avoided language that invited grand historical claims. The alternative reading took shape in quiet corners. Analysts who followed signals traffic, diarists who kept notes in lined pads, and civil defense planners who tracked shelter occupancy saw a storm that remained orderly only when you zoomed out. Zoomed in, it flickered and swayed like a canopy under gusting wind. That insight did not travel far because it lacked images that would carry on television. Green-tinted footage from rooftops had an almost hypnotic calm. It disguised the repetition that wore people down. In cities, shopkeepers learned to open late, close early, and take cash only. In towns, elders measured risk by the tone of the morning, a habit learned in earlier crises and applied again now. Across the border, coalition planners weighed how much to say and how often to say it. A daily cadence had advantages. It set expectations and gave reporters a place to focus. It also created pressure to keep the story simple. Some details would never fit inside the time allowed. That left space for speculation, not just among viewers, but among those living with the war. When images showed pinpoint events, locals filled the gaps with their own maps and their own sense of where to move and when. The perception that the conflict had become manageable shaped choices that were not always safe. A driver took a route he had avoided the day before, believing the worst had passed. He reached his destination, but the journey took twice as long as usual because access points had shifted. A teacher walked to her sister's home across a district that looked undisturbed and returned in darkness, unsettled by the echo of distant pressure she could not place. In the Gulf, merchant crews tracked news on shortwave and adjusted sailings to avoid crowded lanes. Reporters continued to craft concise summaries of complex days, because concise summaries are what fit between commercial breaks and headlines. Some attempted long-form pieces that layered voices and fragments of routine. Those stories did not air as often, but they left a record that scholars later valued for texture. The shape of public perception has power. It influences policy choices, diplomatic timing, and the patience of distant audiences. If a war seems neat, patience rises and caution falls. If a war seems messy, patience drops and pressure for a quick end increases. In 1991, the neat version tended to win the hour because it came with footage that looked new and decisive. The messy version moved in memoranda and short cables that circulated among offices and did not make a sound. For the people under the skies, both versions were true in pieces. Precision limited some harms, and still, the night pressed down with a weight that statistics could not lift. Careful plans reduced mistakes, and still, the street near a relay station felt unsafe after dark. Managed perception was not a plot. It was a product of selection and time limits. That understanding allows a more human reading of the period. It was a time when presentation promised clarity, and the ground delivered partial clarity at best. In that distance between two truths, events continued to advance, and planners prepared to turn the fast rhythm of images into the slower rhythm of holding ground. As broadcasts closed with confident summaries, crews along the front wrote tomorrow's route numbers on index cards and set them beneath red-filtered lights, ready for the late message that would decide how they woke the morning. By the third week, the campaign's character depended less on the spectacle of the night and more on the steady math of distance, repair, and human stamina. The open arcs on studio maps hid a truth that every driver knew: the desert multiplies effort. A liter of water consumed is weight that must be replaced. A tire that meets a hidden ridge does not ask permission before it splits. A convoy that parks 10 meters off a planned line adds minutes to a chain that was razor-thin to begin with. Logistics officers accepted this without complaint, because their craft has always been a trade in margins. They spoke in simple words about turns, loads, and times. Their world ran on receipts and route cards that tracked what came, what went, and what was owed in return. Field logs and depot ledgers serve as reliable indicators for this grind. Behind the lines, pallets shifted from stacks to vehicles, then to hands and smaller stacks closer to the front. Each movement carried a small chance of error. A mislabeled crate could starve a point of something basic for a day. A missed handoff could force a unit to idle during the hour when movement would be easiest. None of these events made news because none were dramatic alone. Together they decided whether the plan remained solid. In many sectors it did. The coalition had time to prepare and used it. Roads were scouted, staging sites were picked, and alternate paths were marked on maps with pencil lines that looked tentative but carried authority. Even so, the desert wrote its own edits. A wind event closed a set of routes for an afternoon and sent a shallow tide of sand across a hard surface that crews had relied on for 2 weeks. The barrier was small. The delay felt large to those who waited. Repair teams adjusted, swept lanes, and guided traffic through narrower passages. The official language was calm: minor delays, operations unaffected, safety maintained. The alternative reading noted the energy cost and the way that many small adjustments consume the attention of leaders who would rather spend focus on timing and direction. Aid groups inside the region experienced similar pressures on a smaller scale. A municipal yard that had served as a distribution point filled with families earlier than expected, so a second site was marked and opened. Paper forms collected names and needs in neat columns, and a clerk who had not slept enough still wrote each entry with care. People did not ask for luxuries. They asked for water, a safe corner, and knowledge about roads. The agency bulletin for that day used the same sparse format it always used. It recorded the shift from one site to two and the uncertainty about the next delivery. Their precision was human rather than technical. It kept focus on who stood in line and what would meet them there. In the same hours, coalition planners considered the shape of the final push. The ground phase had not yet broken. The air pressure continued. The line between staging and advance had thinned. Timing mattered. Move too soon, and you outrun the capacity to feed the line. Move too late, and you give the opposing side time to settle in deeper. Weather and visibility argued for earlier rather than later, but schedule changes cascade, and a change in one sector ripples through all adjacent sectors. Coordination meetings grew shorter and more frequent. Agenda notes for those meetings, later found in archives, read like the minutes of any large project. Attendance, updates, concerns, decisions. Only the context added gravity. Soldiers managed fatigue by routine. Sleep was rationed, meals were plain, and small rituals kept people centered. Letters home were written at odd angles on knee boards and stowed in pockets until a post run appeared. The tone of these notes avoided drama. It reported health, asked about small issues, and described the weather. At the edge of the battlefield, civilians lived in that same rhythm of practical detail. A farmer checked a well and found it low. A teacher noted that her school had become a shelter and that the children were quiet during the day but restless at night. A clinic received supplies and distributed them with a record of names that added up to a simple truth. People were doing what people do in hard times. They were steady when they could be and stubborn when they must be. In the evening, the sky turned the color it always turns in that season, and the desert sent up a thin coolness that allowed engines to run strong. Units used that window to move where they could without drawing attention. Signals remained brief. A few words moved entire groups, and silence moved them again. The strain of distance showed most at the edges. A scout team returned with sunburned necks and quiet smiles after a long day that held nothing dramatic but carried risk from start to finish. A depot manager took 10 minutes to drink water in shade after a count that ran long because an inventory sheet had torn. On a skyline where nothing appeared, a convoy pilot watched the horizon for dust and saw none, then looked down at an odometer and calculated that the line was farther ahead than the mind wished to believe. The machine of the campaign continued to turn, smoothed by preparation and disciplined people, yet always subject to the small variables that make a plan into a lived sequence. This was the hour when momentum could be lost, not by force, but by fatigue. It was also the hour when habits pay off. Checklists catch what pride misses. Spare parts replace bravado. Clear notes replace rumor. In the cities, broadcasts maintained their careful tone. The world watched and felt that the end might be near. Near is not a number in war. It is a feeling that gets confirmed only later. For those on the line, near meant another night of measured motion and another morning of simple work that had to be done correctly. The map that once showed a distant objective now showed a mark that felt reachable. That feeling focused minds and persuaded cautious leaders to consider a final alignment that could turn lines of movement into a closing hand around the planned ground. The order for the ground break came with less ceremony than people might imagine. It appeared in a sequence of messages that looked like the messages the units had read for weeks, and it slotted into a timetable that had been rehearsed in parts many times. The difference was scope. What had been practice and partial steps became whole. Engines grew louder in aggregate, though each cab felt as it always felt. Drivers breathed twice, looked once more, and took the first gate at the scheduled minute. The coalition moved with a confidence built on repetition and a caution born of sand. The aim was not to chase, it was to peel away resistance and to pass between what could be bypassed. The night favored movement because air was cooler and eyes were ready. Under that cover, armored lines and support trains widened in concert, then narrowed when terrain insisted. House lights in distant settlements flickered as families weighed whether to hold in place or step into courtyards and listen for news delivered by the sky. Public briefings retained their calm register and, if anything, grew more concise. They reported that positions were being taken and that opposition looked thin where it had been expected to be thick. Field notes confirmed that some fortified points were found light and that others were abandoned in haste. Along one corridor, the ground showed marks of a hurried retreat. Bundles dropped at turnoffs, weapons left under tarps, and crates that had been opened and left half empty. Yet a retreat is not a simple gift to an advancing force. Abandoned ground can carry hazards, and a road that looks clear can hold surprises. The coalition advanced as if each turn deserved respect. At the edges, contact brought a few sharp exchanges that ended quickly and left crews holding their breath. People counted and then moved on. The speed of events threatened to distort judgment, and leaders knew it. They reminded subordinates to mark what mattered and to let noise pass. One sign mattered more than most during those hours: traffic moving away from key points faster than it could be slowed. The opposing side in many sectors appeared less interested in holding lines than in avoiding encirclement. In studio terms, that looked like a decisive turn. In field terms, it looked like a race to avoid mistakes. Bridges that had carried light vehicles were tested by heavy ones. Shoulders that had borne 3 weeks of convoys now took the weight of an entire arm. A few cracks showed. Repair teams moved with practiced speed. When they could not repair, they routed around. The vocabulary stayed plain because plain words were the only kind that functioned under stress. In the cities, relief groups noted a second wave of civilians who moved not because of direct pressure, but because they believed the next days would be unpredictable. Community halls filled, lists grew. Makeshift kitchens turned out food from limited stocks. A bulletin remarked that people were quiet and purposeful and that they wanted directions more than supplies. That is the kind of note that carries weight later. It tells you that the period had become about orientation rather than force. As the coalition lines reached their planned marks, observers recognized a result that would resonate in capitals far away. The breadth of the coalition had held, the schedule had largely held, and the opposing side looked dispersed and unsure. Studio anchors used phrases that were almost relieved. The ground phase seemed to confirm months of preparation. Those closer to the line felt the knot in their stomachs loosen and then tighten again, because endings are fraught. People get careless when pressure drops. Others become desperate. Planners worried about final day losses that would scar the record and the memory of those responsible for others. They turned worry into procedure. Clear the next 2 points, check the routes, check again, keep the pace steady, do not chase. Reports from that day preserve the sound of those cautions. They are not dramatic. They are deeply human. The opposing side's withdrawal accelerated in some corridors, and pockets that had seemed dangerous grew quiet. A sense of collapse spread, yet collapse is not a uniform event. Some streets were still dangerous. Some intersections had no rule. The coalition read the pattern and determined that the aim had been met in most respects. There remained questions about boundaries, prisoners, and the state of a capital that had seen nights of pressure and days of strain. Diplomats worked on statements that would land at the right hour with the right balance of firmness and restraint. The line shifted from attack to hold. Units that had moved for days opened cabs, aired gear, and counted again. Crews who had learned to hesitate at every unknown corner now stood still and waited for the word that would let them sit down. It came in stages. First, a pause that felt like a breath held. Then a tapering that turned sounds of engines into sounds of voices. From a certain vantage, the turn seemed abrupt, as if the war had stopped mid-sentence. That was how it felt for many. A night that began with movement ended with the awareness that movement might not be necessary for a while. The edge of danger did not retreat fully. It rarely does in the hours after a fight ends. But the ground felt different underfoot, and the air felt less tight. On paper, the operation would soon be framed as brief. For those who lived its hours, brief does not mean small. It means compressed effort and concentrated risk, held within a window that now began to close. The day ended as it had begun, with notes written in careful hands and a quiet that many found difficult to trust. That quiet set the scene for the first conversations about what had been achieved and what might follow in places, still adjusting to the sudden change in pressure. When the engines fell silent and messages eased from urgent to routine, the region's soundscape returned to its older forms. The wind spoke first, lifting grit from the flats, then dropping it again. Markets opened a fraction, tested by customers who watched the sky as much as the shelves. Radios shifted from alerts to music, then back to short updates. In hotels near the Gulf, correspondents packed their tapes and wrote endings that tried to match the public mood. They spoke of a short war and a modern method, and they were not wrong for saying so. Yet the diaries, the depot ledgers, and the spare bulletins from relief teams preserve a parallel truth. Precision can shape an outcome and still leave uneven marks that last beyond a broadcast cycle. The people who waited out the nights now faced decisions about return, repair, and the small costs that do not fit into a headline. Leaders drafted statements that balanced restraint with confidence. They measured words because words would frame memory. A claim made today becomes a benchmark for tomorrow. The coalition reviewed its timelines and prepared to stand down in stages, mindful that a careful exit often matters as much as a careful entry. In the cities and along the roads, families sought relatives who had moved without notice and found them by luck more than by plan. Supply teams accounted for what remained and logged lessons that sound ordinary until you need them again. The narrative of a brief and controlled conflict will live beside the narrative of a long week that stretched every hour to its limit. Both belong to the same record. As the final communiques moved through wires and the last scheduled briefings drew to a close, the horizon held steady. No grand final chord sounded, only the steady return of tasks that define peace in practical terms. It leaves a quiet question, hard to resolve but necessary to hold. How much of what felt new will remain in the habits and decisions of those who plan the next crisis? And how much will dissolve back into the older patterns that deserts and cities remember when the screens go dark?